Hello guys, and welcome back to another solved true crime video. If you're new around here, I do mostly Australian true crime cases, a lot of solved true crime if that's your thing, and today we are focusing on the case of Jill Meagher. Now this was a pretty huge case here in Australia, and in the grand scheme of things it was pretty recent as well. And I would also love to know for my international viewers, have you heard of this case? Just out of curiosity. But without further ado, let's get into the case of Jill Meagher. So in 2012, Gillian Meagher, who was born Gillian McKeon, was a 29-year-old Irish-born woman living in Melbourne, Australia. And she was more commonly known in the media as simply Jill Meagher. She was described by loved ones as vivacious, funny, smart, delightfully goofy, and affectionately called clumsy by her mother. She was born on October the 30th, 1982 in a place called, I think it's pronounced, but I'm probably wrong, Drogheda. It's one of the oldest towns in Ireland, so if any of my friends are Irish, please correct me. When Jill was just 9 years old, back in 1991, her and her whole family moved over to Perth, Western Australia, which is right here where I live, because her father, George McKeon, got a new job. The McKeon family only spent about 5 years living in Western Australia before moving back to Ireland. Jill would go on to complete her education in Ireland and go on to complete a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University College of Dublin. After she graduated, she worked for Irish national broadcaster RTE. In 2008, Jill married Tom Meagher, and the pair had actually met at university. The following year, in 2009, the newlyweds actually moved to Australia, but this time Jill moved to Melbourne, Australia. Jill soon obtained a similar job as she'd had back in Ireland in broadcasting, working at the ABC, or the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I shouldn't have to look down at my notes to know what that stands for. Jill worked in an administrative role at the ABC, but occasionally did on-air work for the 774 ABC Melbourne radio station. One colleague even described Jill as running rings around most of us and keeping everybody in line. That colleague also described Jill as having a very self-deprecating humour, loving high heels and high fashion. And they even described Jill as a little bit flamboyant. Jill and Tom Meagher settled into Melbourne well, settling into their new jobs, although I couldn't find the reason why they had moved to Melbourne, but regardless, they settled in here, or over there in Melbourne, and her parents or her family actually moved back to Perth, Australia, where they had been living back in 1991. Jill kept in touch with her parents and in 2012 had flown over to visit them, but particularly was visiting her father, who was ill of health after just having a stroke. On September the 21st of 2012, which was a Friday, her and her co-workers, Jill and her co-workers, went for after-work drinks at about 5:45 p.m. that evening. This wasn't uncommon for Jill at all. She was a very social person and she loved going for work drinks with her ABC colleagues. The bunch first headed to the Brunswick Green Bar, which was in Brunswick on Sydney Road. They later moved on to Bar Etiquette, which was like a trendy little bar that doesn't exist anymore, on the same road, Sydney Road. At this point, Jill actually did text her husband Tom to come join her and her friends for drinks, but unfortunately Tom had already fallen asleep. It also should be noted that Jill and Tom lived incredibly close to where they were all going out for drinks, like literally walking distance. So if Tom had been awake, he could have easily gone and walked to meet Jill, but of course, he was asleep, so he missed out on the evening. Jill ended up leaving Bar Etiquette at around 1:30 a.m. that morning after having a bit of a nightcap with a co-worker. The co-worker actually offered to walk Jill home and even suggested to her that she catch a cab, I should say. But Jill declined, knowing how incredibly close she lived to the Bar Etiquette, and that was about 500 meters walking distance, or 1640 feet. So like minutes away basically. So then Jill began the very short walk home to her flat after saying farewell to this co-worker. And as a quick side note or personal note to this story, I'd actually been staying in Brunswick with a friend literally months before this happened in 2012. We walked together to Bar Etiquette, we walked back. It was a safe, well-lit area. It didn't feel like anything bad could happen. It was a very trendy area, or I feel like it is. I don't obviously live in Melbourne and I don't know heaps about the place, but the vibe I get from Brunswick is it's pretty laid back, pretty artsy, and it's pretty safe as well. If any of my viewers are from Melbourne, please give me your sort of insight into the area, but that's just the vibe I got from going there back in 2012. I did just want to add that in for a bit of context on the area of Brunswick and Jill's choice to walk home. On Jill's short walk home, she actually phoned her brother briefly to discuss their father's ill health. A short time later, Jill's husband Tom awakens in the very early hours of Saturday morning and realizes that his wife is not home. He searches the house, he calls and texts her over like a period of time, not just all at once, and continues to try to get in contact with his wife Jill until the early hours of Saturday morning. I couldn't find at what time he awoke, but he may not have even have known what time he woke up, but basically Jill had not mentioned staying at a friend's house and she was not answering her phone or replying to text messages, which would send alarm bells through your head as a husband. And of course, having said that, it did not take long for Tom to phone the police and let them know that his wife, Jill Meagher, was missing. Initially, Jill was classified and treated as a missing persons case. It was quickly discovered that her phone was dead, so unfortunately she couldn't be traced through that, and that she had not used any of her bank accounts since she went missing the evening before or in the early hours of that morning. Her friends and family immediately started to search for Jill, in particular putting the word out on social media that Jill was missing. And I think this is something I haven't really talked about on this channel as it's such a recent phenomenon. The amount of recent or current cases using or utilizing social media to put the word out and track down loved ones is incredible. I mean, I'm not just talking about Facebook. If we look at, even here on YouTube, if we talk like Twitter, all sorts of things that didn't exist 10 to 15 years ago are now being used to track down missing people or solve cases. And let me tell you, Jill's case was huge on social media. Her name, her face was everywhere. And she was across all forms of social and traditional media as well. And I'll talk a bit more about why towards the end that I believe, and many believe, that this story was so big, because of course she's not the only woman to go missing in Melbourne or Australia, but why did this case have such an impact? And I'll go into the impact more towards the end as well. And just 2 days after Jill went missing, a Facebook page was started entitled Help Find Jill Meagher, and that was on the 23rd of September 2012 that started. Within days, it had over 100,000 people following, which is incredible. This page, of course, does not any longer exist because it's not relevant, being this is a solved case. As I said, Jill's name and face were being plastered across traditional social media as well. So that means, television, radio, newspapers. And this was a lot because of the social media presence her case had. The whole public really wanted to know what had happened to this woman. And I think we can put that down to the fact that she was a normal girl going about a normal night, having drinks with colleagues, and going beginning her short walk home, and she disappears into nowhere. It's a scary thing for the public to think that can happen. She wasn't doing anything untoward. She wasn't in a dangerous situation. She was literally out for drinks on a Friday night, like thousands of people across the country, and she she's there one minute and she is gone the next. And that's terrifying. It's fascinating to the public, but it's terrifying. And so the public wanted to know what had happened. And if someone was responsible, they wanted that person caught immediately. And this brings me to detectives on the case. Now, they did not engage with any social media posts or groups, pages, followings, etc., because they were already under enough pressure to solve this case, considering how big it had become. So by further engaging with it, it wasn't going to help them. So they pretty much stayed off of social media altogether. So of course, as with any case of this nature, the husband has to be looked into, and Tom was looked into. In the majority of cases that are similar to Jill's, the victim often knows the perpetrator. If you weren't aware of this fact, I think, don't quote me, it's like 10% of victims that don't know the person that has done something to them. Police also talked to Jill's work colleagues at the ABC who had been out with her that night or had seen her that day, and also talked to Jill's brother who had been on the phone with her that morning that she disappeared. So her brother would have been the last person speaking to her and would have been able to give an insight into her state of mind and any potential that she may have been upset, angry, depressed, potentially running away. Unfortunately, many on social media did speculate that Tom Ma was involved in his wife's disappearance, but Tom was actually really quickly cleared by police. And Tom, who is an extraordinary and courageous human being, but I'll get into that later in the video, really, even though he was treated, I guess, like any other husband of a missing wife, but, you know, treated like a suspect, he was very accepting and gracious of the way police handled everything in this case. Police did eventually conclude that Jill Meagher was most likely abducted by a stranger. On the 23rd, which was the Sunday night, so Jill had gone missing on the Friday night / Saturday morning, investigators on the case began to play with the idea or the notion that this was a homicide investigation. And some investigators at this point even admitted to believing that Jill was already dead. And public pressure only continued to mount when Tom Ma was ruled out as a suspect, because as soon as someone like a husband, a wife, all family, all friends are ruled out and someone is missing, as the public, you immediately think, well, if a random has done this to another random person, they can and probably will strike again. So the pressure really mounts on investigators to solve a case like this. So on Monday, September the 24th, the Monday after Jill's disappearance, her handbag was actually found in a laneway in Brunswick. The laneway was near Hope Street, and this was incredibly close to where Jill lived. However, the laneway where the bag was found had actually been searched by police 2 days previous on the Saturday, and they had not found her handbag. And this wasn't like a tiny little thing. I'll put some pictures on screen of the handbag now. The possibility that police missed it is pretty much impossible, which means someone had either come back to the scene and put it there, or something else strange had happened. And I'm going to spoil it now. Something else strange had happened. The perpetrator did not come back and police did not miss it. Jill herself did not put it there. It turns out the handbag had actually been found by a member of the public. So this member of the public was a local shopkeeper, and they found Jill's handbag in the laneway on the Saturday morning, the day after Jill disappeared. And they took the handbag and took it to their shop with them, most likely thinking nothing of it, didn't report it or anything like that. In fact, this member of the public didn't even report the found handbag after they heard about Jill's disappearance. So this member of the public had a phone call from their daughter telling them about the Jill Meagher case. And this shopkeeper at this point thought they should put the handbag back in the laneway where they found it. Look, we don't all do smart things in life, but if you know a woman is missing from that area and you find a handbag, take it to the police. Don't be like, well, I found it, oh, I better just put it back. Like, just a little bit of life advice. Even if there's no one reported missing and you find a woman's handbag or man's handbag, I don't know, or wallet in kind of a weird area, even if you don't report it to the police, just hand it in to the police. And this mishap potentially and unfortunately delayed developments in the Jill Meagher case. The laneway where the bag was found was then forensically examined by detectives on the case, and further up the laneway, like much further up the laneway, two things were found: some unsmoked cigarettes and an ABC pencil, like ABC where Jill worked, a pencil from that workplace. These were both found on the ground, and near these two pieces of evidence, the pencil and the unsmoked cigarettes, was something that did not look good to detectives. And that was a piece of flattened turf that to them looked like an area where someone may have been assaulted. On September the 24th, the Homicide Squad take over Jill Meagher's case. The Homicide Squad thoroughly search Tom and Jill's flat, and they take away her car for testing. On September the 25th, which was the Tuesday after Jill disappeared, CCTV footage was handed in to police and eventually released to the public. Now, this CCTV footage came from a shop owner in Brunswick, a bridal shop called the Duchess Boutique on Sydney Road, and they believe they may have spotted Jill on their CCTV footage. In the footage, which was recorded from inside the bridal store, and I'll put either the footage or an image on screen so you know what I mean from the point of view that we're seeing the street from, we can indeed see Jill Meagher. The employee was correct. And at this point in front of the bridal store, Jill Meagher was only 450 metres or 1476 feet away from her home. And as a side note, this CCTV footage, which I will either include throughout this video or put a link below to the whole thing, it's only a couple of minutes, it's always given me the creeps. Like, something just seems off about Jill's demeanour. You can tell she doesn't seem comfortable, and things only get weirder as you watch it. So at 1:43 a.m. on the CCTV footage, you can see Jill talking to an unidentified man wearing a blue hooded jacket. The conversation between the two seems pretty neutral at first, but it does seem like the man is trying to persuade Jill of something, and she can be seen shaking her head. Now, this is pretty clear footage, and it's quite fortunate really that Jill was standing where she was when this man approached her. Otherwise, we may not have been able to see clearly what was happening. At one point in the footage, you can see Jill waving her phone around at this mystery man, potentially telling him that she needs to make a call. And when that CCTV footage is looked at just minutes before the blue hoodie man and Jill are talking, the mystery man can be seen walking past to the camera and then turning around when Jill walks past, as if to go back to talk to her or follow her or something else. And this is when the mystery man engages in the brief conversation with Jill. It always appears that this blue hoodie man may have been cruising the street that night, looking for God knows what. And then the last thing we see on this CCTV footage relating to Jill's disappearance is the mystery man running past the camera, what looks like to be running after Jill. And that's the last footage we ever see of Jill Meagher. Police were able to actually get a lot more CCTV footage of Jill from the night that she went missing, including when she was leaving her work, walking down the street, and each bar she went to that night. So I guess at least we can be thankful that there is a heck of a lot of CCTV cameras on the streets of Melbourne. The homicide squad then switched their focus to figure out who this man in the blue hooded jacket is. And on this same day, they actually do a second search of Tom and Jill's flat. So this CCTV footage of the blue hoodie man outside the bridal store is so clear, in fact, that one of the detectives working on Jill's case actually thinks he recognizes this man, and he can produce a name as well. It turns out the name of the man this detective produces has an extensive criminal history of violence against women. There was actually a very short period between this blue hoodie man being identified and his arrest. As this had been a random attack, if this man was involved, it was highly likely he would strike again. On September the 27th, the Thursday after Jill has disappeared, and almost being a week since her disappearance, the man in the blue hooded jacket talking to Jill outside the bridal shop is identified, and his name is Adrian Ernest Bailey. He's a 41-year-old pastry chef turned pipe player. Police raid Adrian Bailey's home, where they retrieve Jill's smashed SIM card, his blue hoodie from the CCTV with Jill, as well as his car and a shovel. At the time, detectives don't know that the SIM they retrieved from his home is Jill's, but it doesn't take them long to identify it as Jill's using the reference number that is written on the SIM. They just had to ring up Vodafone and get it verified, basically. At 2:30 p.m. that day, Bailey is arrested by detectives on Jill's case and is questioned at great length. He's described as very confident and pretty relaxed during the whole interview initially. And of course, he claims that he has nothing to do with Jill Meagher's disappearance. But when presented with the evidence against him thus far in the investigation, his confidence and relaxed demeanor changes, even becoming very angry at one point. So angry that they had to actually send a police officer to stand outside the door of the interview room in case things escalated and got violent. His go-to answer for all the evidence that was constantly piling against him was, "Can't explain it, can't explain it, can't explain it." However, when the interviewer mentions the smashed SIM card they found in Bailey's home, telling him the SIM card is registered to Jill Meagher, "Can you explain that?" Bailey states to him, "I don't want to explain that." They take a break from the interview process at this point, but just moments later, Bailey asks to continue the interview. He re-enters the interview room, somewhat willing to talk, but also wanting to negotiate with the police. He states, "I want to get it off my chest. I effed up, alright?" Adrian Ernest Bailey finally confesses to killing Jill Meagher, strangling her to death in Brunswick before burying her body. Bailey does continue his confession, mostly making the whole thing about him and telling the interviewer how much the world is against him. Also, in his confession, he doesn't really specify what he done to Jill. He kind of just says he did it, but doesn't give much detail at all. It's just about him. It's just about Adrian Bailey to him. At 10 p.m. that evening, Adrian Bailey leads detectives to where he buried Jill. Well, he eventually leads them there. When they drive out to the area, he either can't quite remember where he buried her or is just leading detectives around in circles for the fun of it, basically. And when they finally arrive at the seemingly random location that Bailey has no connections to, detectives get out but Bailey refuses to leave the car. Jill Meagher is found in a shallow grave on Black Hill Road near Gisborne South. It is found that Jill was indecently assaulted and strangled to death. Two of the forensic investigators that attended the crime scene that day never returned to work. On September the 28th, just after 2 a.m. on the Friday, Adrian Ernest Bailey is charged with the indecent assault and death of Jill Meagher. While held in custody, Bailey attempts to take his own life. It's also revealed to the public at this time the shocking news that Adrian Bailey was actually on parole at the time he killed Jill. It's also revealed he is a serial offender of assaulting women, and he has a very violent and sadistic past. In fact, Bailey had recently, avoided going to jail after severely bashing a man in Geelong. He had initially been given a 3-month jail term for the attack, but Bailey actually appealed against this length of his term of imprisonment and was let out on parole. And during this parole period, Adrian Ernest Bailey would go on to brutally kill Jill Meagher. Adrian Bailey had actually previously been convicted for indecently assaulting a woman. He was sentenced to 5 years for this crime, and he served 22 months of this sentence. 22 months is not even half of that. It's not even 2 years. It's after being released from 22 months in jail, he went on to indecently assault 6 more women in Geelong. His sentence for assaulting 6 further women accumulatively was 14 months. Not 14 years, 14 months for all 6 assaults. After being released from this jail term, he went on to indecently assault 13 to 14 more women before killing Jill Meagher. And Bailey had been committing similar crimes, similar violent assaults against women since he was a teenager, in his late teens. In fact, his crimes only seemed to escalate over the years, yet considering he was a repeat offender, that didn't really seem to make any difference in how he was sentenced. And Bailey had somehow convinced parole officers that he should be released from every single jail term he was ever sentenced to. God knows how, but he did. All in all, Adrian Ernest Bailey had attacked 22 women in his lifetime, and yet he was a free man at the time he killed Jill. Honestly, to add my 2 cents in here, most of us should be able to agree that Bailey should not have been a free man walking the streets that night that Jill was killed. I don't know what the parole officers or parole board were thinking. I'm just going to leave my opinion there. It also later came out that Bailey admitted to lying his way through a sex offenders program, but also lied his way through an assessment with a psychiatrist. I have a little article that I'm going to have on the screen now if you want to pause the screen and have a quick look through the article on Bailey and this issue. Interestingly though, Adrian Bailey did actually have some long-term relationships. He'd been married twice and had 4 children. He was described as a gym junkie who would often work out, but also described as someone with a temper, and those close to him knew all about it. Like Jill, Adrian Bailey's entire night was captured on CCTV footage. Bailey is seen out with workmates on that Friday evening at several different bars. He's also seen out with his girlfriend Ramiza Ali on Swanston Street. Bailey and his girlfriend actually have an argument that night over his jealousy and possessiveness, and Ramiza leaves him out alone, out with friends, and she heads home. Bailey tries calling and texting his girlfriend, but they all go unanswered. So just to reiterate at this point, a man with a violent temper and criminal past has been left out about town, being ignored by his girlfriend after having a few drinks. It's not a good situation. And Bailey does actually eventually head home after this argument with his girlfriend, but he does not stay at home for long. So I couldn't really find out how or why Adrian Bailey got from his home to Brunswick, but somehow he got to Brunswick, and we can assume he caught a taxi because he didn't have his car with him. Bailey actually says that when he saw Jill walking down the street on the night she was killed, he was trying to be friendly, but when Jill rejected him, he got angry. It was only within minutes of when Bailey met Jill that he dragged her into a laneway, indecently assaulted her, and strangled her to death. He then actually fled the crime scene, leaving Jill's body there to go get his car and a shovel and come back to Jill. He loads Jill's lifeless body back into his car and drives 50 kilometers or 31 miles along the Tullamarine Freeway to Gisborne South. Unbeknownst to Bailey, it can be assumed he didn't know this, Jill still had her phone in her pocket, and it was on and it was tracking her movements all the way across Melbourne to her final resting place. And Bailey, of course, had his phone on him and he was being tracked, and if you compare Jill's journey that night and Bailey's journey that night, they exactly match up. He buries Jill's body in a shallow grave before returning home, but not before he runs out of petrol. A member of the public actually sees that Adrian Bailey, not knowing that it was Adrian Bailey, sees he has run out of petrol and very graciously gives him a lift to the petrol station at around 6 a.m. and returns him back to his car. If only that member of the public had known. And this member of the public does actually call the police after Bailey's name and face is made public to tell them that they had given a killer a lift that night, which is terrifying, terrifying, terrifying. Don't give lifts to strangers. Some life advice for you there, don't do it. But this did actually lead police to be able to retrieve more CCTV footage of Bailey from that night, which added to even more evidence against him, because Bailey did claim he was home, or he went home after his argument with his girlfriend, but clearly he didn't. So despite the electronic path that Bailey left behind, most likely unaware of this, and the fact that he was caught on CCTV footage literally everywhere, he made a fair attempt to cover his tracks. On the Saturday evening, the day after he killed Jill Meagher, he can be seen at the petrol station cleaning his car. Again on CCTV, so he's not doing real well for himself. Then on the Monday, Bailey can be seen going to a car dealership and replacing all 4 of his tyres, because he believed that his tyre tracks could be tracked to where he had buried Jill's body. Again, this whole situation, him having his tyres changed, and his tyres weren't even in a bad condition, so it really makes no sense. This is all tracked on CCTV footage as well. So now I'm just going to talk about a bit of the public reaction from Jill's death and her body being found. In the days following Jill's body being recovered, thousands of bouquets of flowers were laid in places associated with Jill. So outside of the bridal store, outside of the Baptist church that I believe she attended, outside of her flat, and at the place she was buried. And along with these bouquets of flowers were cards, letters, notes from thousands of members of the public that never even knew Jill. A candlelit vigil is also held at the Brunswick Baptist Church, and Jill's mother, Edith McCann, can be seen at these locations, or at the location in front of the bridal store in particular, reading the notes, the cards, the letters, and looking at the bouquets of flowers from thousands of strangers that didn't even know her daughter, but took a moment out of their day to show her family that they cared. Edith McKeon publicly thanked the Australian public for their support. On the 30th of September 2012, 2 days after Jill's body was recovered, a public march was organised in her honour. Women in the area, or all local residents in fact, felt that Jill was one of them. Jill could have been them. Jill could have been their daughter or their son or their mother or father or sister or brother. She was just one of us. The march was also for the fact that women in particular felt that they should have the right to walk home alone at any time of the day or night. This march was really about taking back the streets and remembering Jill Meagher. So 30,000 people turned up for this march. And I will throw up some photos on the screen because these images are incredible. It blows my mind, it really does. What an incredible turnout. So this walk along Sydney Road stretched for a few kilometres and concluded in Princess Park for a moment of silence for Jill Meagher. The march also highlighted another topic, and a topic which I am very passionate about, and that is violence against women and just the general safety of women in our society. And my fellow Australians will know that Jill was not the last victim to be snatched off the streets of Melbourne, brutally assaulted and killed. And there probably will be more, and it's a horrendous thought. We should be able to walk home at any time of the day or night alone, but the sad reality is that we can't. Not at this point in time. Another big aspect of social media in this case was the digital onslaught of Adrian Bailey. Many social media users were not aware that it could jeopardize court proceedings. Revealing past convictions of Adrian Bailey's was one of the many things that online users were sharing and discussing amongst themselves. Tom Meagher was forced to comment during a public statement to stop this online negativity because it could hurt the case or the legal proceedings. On April the 5th, 2013, Adrian Ernest Bailey pleaded guilty to the indecent assault and death of Jill Meagher. In court, Bailey tries to justify his state of mind at the time of the killing and tries to appear remorseful to the McKeon and Meagher family. At this time, Bailey also tells police they should have the death penalty for people like me. On June the 19th, 2013, a packed public gallery sit to watch Adrian Ernest Bailey be sentenced. He is sentenced by Justice Nettle to life in prison with a non-parole period of 35 years, 15 years for the indecent assault, and life in prison for killing Jill Meagher. Justice Nettle states in court that Jill's death was a savage, violent assault of the gravest kind. He stated that he had no doubt that Bailey strangled Jill with the intent to kill. He also said that if not for Bailey's guilty plea, he would have sentenced him to life without parole. Jill's family stated outside of the court that they felt justice had been done for Jill Meagher. Bailey, of course, appealed against his sentence. He argued that his minimum sentence was too long and he did not take perverted pleasure in killing Jill. The appeal was dismissed in less than 10 minutes. In 2015, which was 3 years after Jill was killed, Bailey was charged with a further 3 indecent assaults. These women had come forward after seeing Bailey on the news in association with Jill Meagher. In May of 2015, Bailey was found guilty of 2 out of 3 of these indecent assaults, and his minimum non-parole period was raised from 35 to 43 years. Again, Bailey lodged an appeal against these charges and was given a 3-year reduction this time, meaning that Adrian Bailey will now be eligible for parole in 2055 at the age of 83 years old. And as a result of the Jill Meagher case, Victorian parole laws were tightened, and so they should be. This was one small positive to come out of a horrendous situation, and this is not the first time we have talked about this on this channel, parolees out on the streets that kill. And in fact, just in my last video about the Vega schoolgirls, the 2 men that had killed Lauren and Nicole had been parolees out on the streets. So, I mean, has anything changed since then? I think that's the real question here. And will anything change in the future in regards to the parole laws? The Victorian Premier Dennis Napthine commented, "There is no doubt the system failed Jill Meagher. Under the changes we've introduced, the offender would have been back in jail, not on the streets. Our actions are the minimum we can do to try and make sure this never ever happens again." Tom Meagher left Melbourne, Australia not long after his wife was killed and returned to his home in Ireland in 2013. In 2014, Tom Meagher wrote an article entitled "The Danger of the Monster Myth," and it's about the stereotypes of men that indecently assault women. And this is absolutely worth the read. I will leave the link down below if you're interested. And just a final note, and it's more of a housekeeping note, if I see any victim blaming in the comments of this video, I will block you without question. I have seen so much victim blaming in my videos recently, and this is not the time or the place for it. I don't want to hear anything like she put herself in that situation. She shouldn't have been walking home alone at night. Don't share those thoughts here. I don't want to hear it. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to Jill's story. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you being here. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you soon.